years. So let me begin. Although Rand disliked him at first, Alan Greenspan soon became one of her favorites. At early meetings, he was quiet and somber, earning the nickname the Undertaker from Rand. Heavily influenced by logical positivism, Greenspan was unwilling to accept any absolutes. He became legendary for his confession that he might not actually exist. It couldn't be proved. Hearing this, Rand pounced. And by the way, who is making that statement? To Greenspan, it was a deep exchange that shook his relativist beliefs to the core. By many accounts, Rand excelled at the kind of verbal combat that impressed Greenspan. Hiram Hayden, an editor at Bobbs Merrill and Random House, marveled at Rand's ability to conquer sophisticated New Yorkers in any argument. Quote, "Many are the people who laughed at my description of her dialectical invincibility, only later to try their hands and join me among the corpses on the Randian battlefield." Rand began with the basics, establishing agreement on primary axioms and principles. She came out on top by showing how her opponent's ideas and beliefs contradicted these foundations. This approach was particularly effective on those who prided themselves on logic and consistency, as did Greenspan. He remembered that, quote, "Talking to Rand was like starting a game of chess thinking I was good and finding myself in checkmate." Greenspan was hooked. So Greenspan joined the collective in the mid-50s when Rand was beginning to formulate her mature philosophy of objectivism. Now, you can see elements of objectivism in her early work, but it was really in these years between The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, her second major novel, her third novel overall, that she developed this philosophy. And I'm going to try to summarize it briefly as I can by pointing out four basic tenets that Rand herself identified as fundamental. The first is that objectivism holds there is an objective, knowable reality, hence its name. It takes reason to be an absolute, mankind's only guide to thought and action. It proposes selfishness as a virtue, and it holds that laissez-faire capitalism is the only moral and practical social system. So Rand derived from her reading and her thinking this philosophical system, which she then interwove into Atlas Shrugged. Atlas Shrugged, as some of you know, tells the story of America collapsing under a socialist government. And Rand focuses on her heroes, independent men and women who live by her philosophy of individualism, of selfishness. And through the drama, she hopes to explain why capitalism is the only system that makes freedom possible, the only system that can make a country prosper, because it's the only system that empowers and enables the creators, the producers, to have free rein to let their energies manifest. Now, like all authors, Rand had high hopes for her book, hopes that were cruelly dashed when the reviews came out. Atlas Shrugged was panned left, right, and center. Time magazine asked, quote, "Is it a novel? Is it a nightmare?" Saturday Review said the entire book was shot through with hatred. And perhaps the harshest review came from Rand's old enemy, William Buckley, and his magazine, National Review, which slammed it as dictatorial, arrogant, even fascist. The review of the book, which was called Big Sister is Watching You, was written by Whittaker Chambers, then at the height of his fame and his influence as an ex-communist spy who had become a proponent of conservatism. And Chambers said that the ultimate message of Atlas Shrugged was, quote, "To a gas chamber, go." It was a damning indictment of Rand's work. And Chambers was troubled above all by the fact that Rand saw atheism and the promotion of selfishness as key to capitalism. Conservatives like Chambers were capitalists, but they thought Rand took it too far. She pushed it to the extreme. And what's interesting is just a month ago, in August 2010, National Review published yet another cover story about Ayn Rand, this called The Great Ghastly Rand. And it repeated many of these same themes, focusing, like Chambers did, on the negative tone and imagery in Atlas Shrugged. So wherever you go, there you are. This same feud, this same dynamic continues today. Rand's individualism, her defense of capitalism, makes her both appealing to conservatives and deeply troubling to them. And I would be willing to wager in another 10 to 15 years we might have yet another National Review article on Rand. It's a message that bears repeating because it's a message that never quite gets through, because Rand is a perennial. She's always around. She's always popular. Now, Atlas Shrugged, despite the terrible reviews, launched objectivism as an independent philosophical and political and social movement. It was promoted primarily by the Nathaniel Branden Institute, which was founded by Nathaniel Branden. The NBI Institute began in the 1960s. It flourished at its height. It was educating thousands of students across the country. Rand had her own newsletter with 20,000 subscribers. Every time she issued a book of nonfiction, the same thing that happened to Atlas Shrugged would happen. Terrible reviews, sales would go through the roof. So she really created, through the Nathaniel Branden Institute, through her objectivist philosophy, she created her own world and subculture. You could socialize and live and talk and argue with other objectivists, particularly in Los Angeles, Boston, New York. There was a heavy concentration of these lectures. They worked by tape transcriptions. So you would, if you were in New York, you could go hear Branden or Rand lecture in person. If you were in some other city, you would sign up for the course. You would go at the designated hour to a rented room, and someone would press a tape recorder with Branden speaking. So it was kind of a podcast before podcasts existed. So by creating her own world and her own subculture, Rand really was one of the first people to do an end run around the mainstream media and say, if you're not going to treat me with respect, if you're not going to praise my books, I'm going to do it my own way. I don't need you. I can go directly to my readers, directly to my fan base. Now, as it turned out, that fan base was particularly strong on college campuses. And as historians are beginning to uncover, in the 1960s, there was a real ferment of conservative thought and political activism among students. We tend to remember the anti-war protesters, the hippies. We now know this was only a small piece of a larger picture, and perhaps more students were involved in conservative politics, conservative organizing, than in the more high-profile left-leaning protests that have captured our historical imagination thus far. So I would be willing to wager, I don't know for sure, that Wabash probably had some kind of objectivist club. Maybe someone here will do a history research project and look into it. But it would make a lot of sense that she was very popular. And, there were many reasons, because Rand's ideas fed into the spirit of the 60s in many ways. They were anti-authoritarian. She was against the draft. Her novels were sexually explicit. She herself didn't approve of drug use, but she believed that drugs should be legalized. So there were a lot of ways that she fit with the spirit of the age, even while being conservative or contrary. Now, as I'm talking here about the Nathaniel Branden Institute, you might be wondering, who is this Nathaniel Branden guy, and what is he doing promoting her ideas? So I'm going to read you a brief excerpt here that catches their relationship at a critical transition. And this is taking you back to the mid-50s when the two are in New York and the beginnings of the collective, this weekly salon, is beginning. Although it started innocently enough, there had always been a current of flirtation between the two. Rand made no secret of her esteem for Nathan, openly identifying him as a genius. His face, she said, was her kind of face. The Brandens' marriage only briefly papered over the growing attraction between Ian and Nathan. The subtext of their relationship spilled into the open during a long car ride to Canada in the fall of 1954. The two couples and another friend had taken a road trip to visit Barbara's family. On the ride home, Barbara watched her husband and Rand holding hands and nuzzling in the back seat of the car. Sick with jealousy and anger, she confronted him afterward. Nathan denied everything. He and Rand had a special friendship, nothing more. His sentiment was genuine. Nathan worshipped Rand. But it was Barbara he had chosen, or so he consciously believed. Like Barbara, Ayn had registered a shift. The next day she summoned Nathan to her apartment, where she waited alone. It was a scene out of the best romantic fiction. After some delay, Rand became urgent and direct. She and Nathan had fallen in love, yes? Nathan, overwhelmed, flattered, excited, confused, responded in kind. They kissed hesitantly. There would be no turning back. But this was still the founder of objectivism, believing in rationality above all else. They must be honest with their spouses, Rand decided. She called them all to a meeting at her apartment. As Barbara and Frank listened incredulously, Rand's hypnotic voice filled the room and stilled their protests. The spell she had cast was too strong to break now. At meeting's end, she and Nathan had secured what they requested, a few hours alone each week. Their relationship would be strictly platonic, they assured their spouses. Privacy would allow them to explore the intellectual and emotional connection they could no longer pretend did not exist. When the inevitable happened, Rand was again honest with both Barbara and Frank. She and Nathan wished now to be lovers, she explained. But it would naturally be a short affair. She had no wish to hold back Nathan, who was 25 years her junior. Her explanation came clothed in the rational philosophy she had taught them all. By giving their feelings full expression, Nathan and Ayn were simply acknowledging the nature of reality. Now the story goes on from there, and I'll refer you here if you'd like to pick up the rest of the thread. But for all the gossip, all the juiciness of Rand's life, which incidentally made this a tremendously fun book to research and to write, I want to focus here on Rand's views on capitalism, because it is this that I want to highlight as one of her contributions to American thought and American debate. I said earlier that capitalism in the objectivist system is considered the most moral and the most practical system. Now, I'll start with the practical. It works better. And Rand wasn't the only one saying this. In fact, plenty of people were making the efficiency-based argument for capitalism. It's the moral argument, and the specific moral argument that Rand made, that is her own contribution, that is unique. Because Rand's defense of capitalism was linked to her revolutionary moral system. You'll remember the opening of the book where she sees the rhetoric of collectivism, the rhetoric of the common good, used essentially for theft and expropriation. That made her suspicious of all values. It caused her to be drawn to the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, and like him to propose a transvaluation of values, where things that were considered good were actually bad, things that were bad were considered good. So a traditional vice like selfishness becomes a virtue, and something like altruism, the idea that we should sacrifice for others or that we owe something to others, became for Rand the greatest evil of all. And in place of altruism, she advanced selfishness, the idea of each person fulfilling their own purpose and their own happiness. Now, it's key to emphasize here that selfishness for her did not mean ruthlessness, which is a connotation we all often attach to selfishness, that, running over anyone who gets in your way. For her, it meant in a more limited way to pursue your own happiness, your own goals, your own vision. This may sound a bit to you like Adam Smith's invisible hand, but it's not, because Rand's idea of selfishness, her morality of selfishness, was more thorough, more capacious than Smith's. It extended to every realm of life, to the personal, to the social, to the individual. And it was not balanced in the objectivist system by any other communal virtues, such as Smith's idea of sympathy, which balances out self-interest in his ideas. Rand tends to depict